So I'm very glad to have this opportunity to basically share with colleagues across the world, particularly on the African continent, on reporting basically China-Africa climate stories. And the topic was actually given by the organizer, which is focused on the so-called complexities. And I think I'm just going to share very briefly some of my observations, personal observations from on the ground in China, so that collectively I think we can produce the kind of stories that actually better inform and engage the global audience. First of all, I would like to share a few graphs, which basically shows the kind of tectonic changes that are ongoing in China, which is sort of shifting the economy in ways that are significant. And if we don't keep track of those key sort of tectonic shifts, we may end up writing stories about a China that was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, right? And based on sort of outdated models, outdated understanding of what's actually going on in China. So on the left side, you can see that first of all, the Chinese economy is not growing as fast as it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. The growth rate has largely peaked around 2007 to 07 and has go down gradually since then. So the Chinese economy is definitely changing gear. It is changing towards a growth model that is slower in terms of growth quantity, but emphasizes more in terms of the growth, of the quality of the growth. And consequently, this has major implications to a lot of these sort of key indicators of economic performance, right? And one of the key area is in energy, right? With a slower growing economy, China's energy demand is also slowly cooling down. It's no longer the kind of economy that is consuming ever more and more energy and consuming ever more and more resources, right? If you look at, for example, coal consumption, it has largely plateaued, so to speak, since around 2013. So there was even 3 years where there was a pretty significant drop from the 2013 level, and there has been some sort of a rebound over the past 4 or 5 years, but still not back to the 2013 level yet. So with the plateauing of energy demand, we're seeing basically an economy that is sort of cooling down a little bit with sort of slightly less of intensive footprint, basically, particularly domestically, on a lot of the sort of resource consumption. And overseas, we're also seeing this sort of reflected, right, into China's decisions across its own boundaries. For example, if you look at Chinese investment or engagement, which includes investment and also contracts, construction contracts, in the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, the shrinking engagement is sort of quite obvious starting from almost 3 years ago, 2019, where afterwards the kind of engagement size just collapsed, so to speak. This is, of course, not just because of the sort of economic slowdown back at home, but also by factors such as COVID and also the general kind of deteriorating global economic prospects and sort of the inability of many countries to continue to absorb investments, particularly in the form of debt, right? And so if we are still talking about, for example, Chinese overseas investment as in the form of massive debt-driven big infrastructure projects, probably it's no longer the case, especially going forward, right? Because there's definitely a movement towards more cautious approaches in overseas investment in the past few years. So those facts or those trends are actually driven largely by the kind of shifting priorities, both domestically and also overseas. So domestically, as I mentioned, China is sort of determined to pursue a developmental path that emphasizes more on quality than quantity at this stage of its development. It's putting a large emphasis on building a so-called ecological civilization, which takes into account the economy's sort of efficiency of using resources such as sort of ecological resources, land, energy, and other inputs, so that it can actually produce a more sustainable developmental model. And internationally, China is also becoming obviously more risk averse. It wants to avoid the kind of massive risky projects that featured its investments over the past decade, but now emphasizes the so-called small but beautiful projects, the projects that with higher return on investment, higher quality, right? It is putting more qualifiers into the kind of overseas projects that it is still carry on, particularly going forward. So some colleagues might have the question, so if this is really going on, right, if this kind of shifts are really going on, then why am I still seeing, right, sometimes problematic projects from Chinese companies? Why, for example, in certain countries, China seems to be continuing behaving in ways that has sort of dominated the kind of patterns over the past decade or so? I think the answer to that question, or an oversimplified answer to that question, is that China is not a monolithic entity, right? So when we are talking about complexity, here comes the complexity. Even when China has, or the central government has policies that are trying to direct the country towards a different developmental model, there are layers and layers of different players that are sort of shaping how those kind of policies and intentions are being played out on the ground. And we're talking about at least 3 levels of players, and in reality, there are probably even more. So the central government, the provincial and local governments, and a large number of Chinese companies, many of them are state-owned companies, and even more of them are actually private companies. And within the state-owned companies, you also have the so-called centrally owned companies versus the so-called provincially owned or even locally owned companies. And although all of those entities has different incentives in the game, basically, and they are sort of collectively shaping how China sort of behaves overseas, and sort of determining what certain projects, the direction of certain projects, where it goes, right? And I'm going to use just one case, a recent case, to just demonstrate how this kind of complexity plays out in this field of climate change. So back in September last year, China made this pretty unprecedented announcement by President Xi Jinping that it is not going to build new coal-fired power plants overseas anymore, right? So this was a big announcement made at the United Nations last year. And if you think that overnight, right, China is going to just, all the constructions that are ongoing across the world by Chinese companies on coal-fired power plants are just going to stop once and for all, right? That's probably a too sort of simplistic understanding of what this announcement means, right? So what actually played out after the announcement is that there was quite a few months, weeks or months, where there was genuine confusion as to what this policy really, or what this announcement really mean in reality. To some extent, this announcement at the very top level of the government was sort of a surprise to many sort of lower level policymakers, and they need to spend time just to hash out the actual details of this policy. And one of such detail is how new is new, right? Because there were at the time of the announcement, there were multiple projects that are in the pipeline, right, which was not built yet, but they have reached certain stages of the development, either they have already raised the fund for the project, or they have reached agreements, they have signed contracts, right? So at that point, there was a big, I think, policy discussion within the Chinese government about where to cut the line, right? How new is new? Where should they draw the line of stopping the construction and building, right? And after that was to some extent resolved, details emerged over the past few months, then still the central government would need to find a leverage, right, or an enforcer of this policy. And one of the most powerful enforcers the central government can rely on is actually the banks, right, the financial sector that was still more or less very much aligned with government policy and to some extent controlled by government. So it was Chinese banks, particularly the state-owned banks, that were the first mover or enforcer of this no new coal pledge made by President Xi at the UN, which means that for a lot of the projects that are trying to secure funding from Chinese banks, right, they probably will get a no, and the lack of funding would lead to the stop of a large amount of projects overseas because of the policies of the banks. But still, even in such cases, there are still loopholes or so-called, there are still companies that are trying to bypass, right, this kind of policies just because in some cases building a coal-fired power plant for a country or for a client still makes money, right, for them. And particularly for Chinese companies that do not rely on Chinese bank financing, for example. Either they can pay it out of their own pocket as investment, or they were paid fully, right, by a client. Right. In those cases, there are still incentives for Chinese companies to pursue a coal-fired power project overseas, even after the top-level policy announcement. So on the ground, what we are seeing is that totally contradictory stories may be true, right, at the same time, right? So in Zimbabwe, for example, ICBC, one of China's largest state-owned banks, has basically pulled away from a previously committed financing for coal-fired power plants, right? Because, as I mentioned, the banking sector was sort of the first mover and really the enforcer of high-level government policy in this case. But on the other hand, you're still also seeing cases where, for example, in certain industrial parks in Indonesia, there might still be some coal-fired power plants projects ongoing because it's a private company and they probably don't need Chinese bank financing for that project to materialize, right? So both stories on this slide can be true just because it's a complex dynamics even after a top-level policy intention was made clear. And there are still plenty of players that can sort of jig the game in ways that favors their own interest. So I think for colleagues here who is sort of attending this workshop, I think there is a very big role that journalists, particularly from host countries in Africa, can play, right, in sort of shaping China's Green Belt and Road initiative, because like the no new coal pledge, those policies are still waiting to be hashed out, right? Waiting to be actually becoming more detailed and implementable on the ground. China has, over the past few months, released multiple guidelines and opinions by the central government on greening the Belt and Road. Many of them are sort of principled language, overall kind of directions. But still, the players, as I mentioned before, will need to live out, right, and make sense of some of those directives on the ground. And in those cases, if journalists and reporters can identify loopholes in the implementation, highlight sort of contradictions in the implementation or opportunities, right, in implementing some of those initiatives, this will actually help make the Green Belt and Road pledge more real on the ground. I think that's sort of the mission of a lot of us here, who is reporting and doing stories on China's footprint in Africa and beyond. And thank you. This is my sharing today.